Okay, boomers, you guys might love this video. I'm going to compare three different generations of parenting styles, starting with the baby boomer generation. So, I think there's a general consensus that we all know how the boomers kind of messed us up, but let's understand why they were doing what they were doing. What does it mean to belong to the boomer generation? It means that there was a boom of people having babies, which means there was a bottleneck in resources, which means there was a scarcity effect, which means there was more of a heavy focus on physical needs rather than emotional needs. This is why a lot of these parents were emotionally unavailable or emotionally damaging. There also wasn't quite an understanding in terms of how important the formative years were. So when they were using physical discipline, harsh criticism, guilt tripping, emotional blackmail, they really didn't understand just how severe the impacts to character development, self esteem, confidence, and healthy mental health functioning would be. Now, we like to think that we now know better, so we do better. But let's talk about two different generations of parents. Let's start with Gen X. Gen X parents are kind of the sandwich generation in the sense of where some of them, let's say half the Gen X parents, were still carrying on what they endured in childhood. Maybe they didn't go into fields where there was a lot of emotional intelligence being developed, let's say because there was statistically a heavier focus on going into the sciences. There was less of an understanding about psychology, less time for self reflection, less emphasis on therapy and healing in that generation still. So they did still carry on an intergenerational trauma pattern where they were doing a heavy focus on the child being very autonomous and independent, and they still weren't able to give what they didn't have because they didn't have that emotional nurturing from the boomer generation, so they weren't able to give it to their kids either. Generally speaking, Gen X parents also came into their time period of autonomy later in life because a lot of them didn't. Let's talk about South Asian Gen X parents. A lot of them didn't become autonomous until after marriage, so they were kind of sowing unsown oats later in life, which is why their party phase never occurred in adolescence, like in a majority cultural group members. That tends to be the norm. But this meant that they were a little bit kind of, let's say, immature parents in the sense of they were maybe overconsumption of alcohol, going out a lot. They never really had their time to rebel and just be free and express themselves. So this generation did do a lot of leaving the child rearing of their children to their parents, meaning a lot of those kids have been raised by their grandparents. Now, like I said at the beginning of that, half of the Gen Xers were doing that because they didn't do the work and they didn't heal their own inner child. So they just projected forward what their parents gave to them. Now, the other half, maybe they did have the luxury and the privilege of being able to explore and resource their wounds and traumas and insecurities. But what we tended to see there was an overcorrection. Have you guys heard of the term helicopter parenting? So, helicopter parenting is where they didn't fully believe in their child's ability to develop grit and resilience. So they were always overcorrecting and really like cotton balling their child, trying to make sure that they never had to endure what they had to endure as a child. So being overly attuned and enmeshed with their child's well-being. And this is problematic in its own sense because you don't view the child as their full autonomous self, nor do you give them the foundation or the legs to be able to stand and be anchored and grounded and then confident and grow into an independent person, because you're overdoing and over helping and over supporting, over correcting, over protecting them because your inner child knows what it feels like to go without. Here's where this gets really problematic. If we have some of the next generation, like the children of the Gen X offspring, being raised in that still emotionally detached, neglectful, sometimes abusive manner, and then we have the other half of society being raised in that over-coddled manner, we now have this strange kind of situation and conundrum where we have some of our peers who we're looking at with envy and kind of insecurity that they're having like this seeming seemingly coddled, really lush and privileged, cushy lifestyle. And then that's making us feel very poorly about ourselves. So we don't develop a secure, healthy attachment style. We don't have full confidence and flourish to our max potential and capacity in our careers. It also influences the type of partners that are going to pair up, because a lot of the children who were over coddled are going to seek out very autonomous, structured, authoritative type of partners. And those authoritative type of partners are the ones who have been raised with a very stern hand. And so when you pair that together, you end up with a type of relationship dynamic where it's almost like one partner is parenting the other partner, which of course we see too much of in our South Asian cultural dynamics, and especially usually girls in our culture who have been maybe raised by Gen X parents are very hyper independent, but then the boys have been coddled and kind of spoon fed and overly taken care of and nurtured, because that is also a component in terms of Gen X parenting. Last but not least, let's talk about millennial parenting. Now, I know a lot of us think we're crushing it, but what we have here is a big generation of something called ambivalent parenting. Ambivalent parenting is where it's very inconsistent. One day you're showing up as your gentle, conscious, nurturing parenting self, and the next day, maybe because you're hungover, because you're burnt out, because your mental health is not doing well, you're showing up in a really inconsistent and negative manner. So the child never knows what to predict. It's constantly spiking and dropping. The ebbs and flows have too many peaks, too many valleys. And this is actually the most harmful type of parenting, because what a child actually thrives on is predictability. So remember at the beginning when I said, hey boomers, you guys are going to love this? At least with the boomer gen style of parenting, every kid kind of knew what they were going to get, more or less. They knew their parent was toxic and that they needed to develop alternative coping strategies in order to deal with their toxic parent. With ambivalent parent, what we're seeing in the millennial generation, it's really hard to develop a toolbox when you can't figure out what you're up against. So the reason for the ambivalent parenting being so prevalent in this generation is possibly because we're oscillating between being regulated and dysregulated, simply because of this current let's say environmental circumstances that we have found ourselves in. Number one, we are all very, very distracted and addicted to our phones. And as we've probably seen those extremely mom shaming and guilt inducing videos where child's trying to get parents' attention and parent is just like doom scrolling and distracted with their phone use. Also just kind of technology slowly advanced into being as woven into our daily hour to hour, minute to minute life that it did for specifically millennials, with social media takeover and the technological boom, and now with AI and all of that kind of stuff. Technological advancements have made it really hard to not be addicted to a screen. So when you have distracted parenting, but the strong intention of doing really fantastic, gentle, conscious, mindful parenting, what is happening is we're not set up for success. There's too many external variables that are holding us back from our intention to be really great parents. It's just not a sustainable, achievable goal, and it's not feasible because of all these extra variables involved. Pair that with the fact that we're constantly being shown depictions of what excellent parenting looks like through social media, because we're all comparing ourselves as parents to one another based on what we're seeing on our Instagram feed. It's a little bit challenging to not accidentally put unrealistic expectations on ourselves and thus on our children. There's a lot of overachievement expectations. Maybe with boomers and Gen X, there was still heavy focus on academic success, but now what we're seeing is much less fixation on straight A report. Well, we don't even have the ABC grading system anymore, but there's a less fixation on that. And now we're all about these extracurriculars. Now, even just think about for yourself, the next time you're out and about rushing your child from activity to activity or from after school to activity, just take a scan of what your energy is like. Are you frantic? Are you rushed? Are you feeling and giving off a vibe of scarcity and stress and panic? And what is your childhood absorbing, or sorry, your child absorbing from all of that? Are you cranky? Are you snappy? Are you short with your children and doing the ambivalent parenting thing where in one moment you're very permissive for mistakes and you're understanding and you're calm because you have that tolerance and bandwidth, but then maybe because you've overloaded your schedule, you're comparing yourself to all your peers, you haven't fully healed all your own inner childhood trauma, that you end up being less than a stellar parent to your child. So really starting to analyze, okay, what are these waves that are currently trending in society in terms of child rearing, and what are the impacts of this going to be one day? I'm really curious to be able to see when these children, this current generation, I think it's called Gen Alpha, I'm not sure, but when this current generation grows up, what are they going to be making videos about? What are they going to be calling us out for? And are we going to have the bandwidth, the space, and the humility to be able to hear all of that once our kids become adolescents? Psychological outcomes that come from this mixed messaging parenting, where we're wanting to walk the walk, but sometimes we're falling short and only talking the talk, is there's going to be a lot of insecure attachment styles, which we're going to see its outcome, as I mentioned previously, in romantic partnerships. There's going to be lots of performance anxiety and burnout because the standard for what you should be able to do and manage in terms of your commitments and obligations and your identity is a really unattainable, too high of a bar. Also identity confusion, because your worth really becomes fused to your performance and your achievements, which we don't want at all. We want people to have an internal command center where they're more driven by who they are as a human being, not a human doing in terms of their values and their natural skills, not kind of what society is applauding and seeing come out of them in terms of like extracurricular activity achievement, sports achievement and activities, all of that kind of stuff. And definitely difficulty regulating emotions because they haven't had that model to them. Now, here's the biggest takeaway, and I do not say this to mom shame or father shame. Why isn't that a term? That should be a term. I do not say this to guilt trip you, but it is a complete contradiction to want to be doing your best as a human, modeling optimal behavior and coping mechanisms, and be consuming alcohol and binge drinking or having hangovers or displaying erratic, inconsistent behavior where all of a sudden conscious parenting hat is hung up for the evening and your child seeing you either act aggressive or extra hyper or just dysregulated and not your usual self. So a lot of us are over consuming alcohol and using it as a coping strategy because it's normalized in society, and those two things just do not mesh. Conscious, gentle parenting and alcohol consumption on a regular, consistent basis, it doesn't go together. It's incongruent, it's contradictory. So hopefully you take all of this with a grain of salt. I know the goal is not perfection, but knowledge is power. So if we have an opportunity to self-reflect, then we can self-correct, and hopefully our kids won't have a laundry list of complaints about us going forward. As usual, thank you all for watching. See you next time.